Today's video is for owners of pure audio project speakers. The speakers over my shoulder are indeed PAP speakers. They're the big boys, the Quintet 15s, but whatever model you have, we want to talk to you about a different product that's available through Pure Audio Project, the PAP-C1. It's an electronic crossover designed by Nelson Pass, the great Nelson Pass. He's a world-renowned electronics designer and owner of First Watt Audio. Now, why would one use an electronic crossover? This is what you do if you want to bi-amp your system. We did a previous video that goes into great detail of the pros and cons of bi-amping. There's a link below. But the basic idea is, rather than have your amplification before the crossover, where the crossover points and the slope is determined, it's done after the crossover. This allows you to attach your amplifiers directly to the drivers that they serve. The first question to address is, should you bi-amp, or should you use a traditional passive crossover such as this? My answer is no, you should not bi-amp. You should stick with the traditional passive crossover. Why? Because these sound great, number one. Number two, if you want to tweak these, you can. Pure Audio Project offers, I won't call them upgrades, but just ways to change capacitors and resistors to tailor the sound to your liking. This is really the best way to go. In addition, if you are going to consider bi-amping, there's a lot of extra things involved, particularly extra money. You're going to have 2 additional amplifiers or an additional stereo amplifier. You're going to have two additional interconnects, 2 additional speaker cables, mains cables. You're going to have 2 additional amplifier stands or shelves on your system to accommodate the amps. It's a lot more money, it's a lot more time, and also you must have separates. You can't have an integrated amp and make this work. You got to have a separate preamp. So for all those reasons, my advice is to stick with the fantastic sounding passive crossover. However, why did we bi-amp? Well, it's a lot of fun. It offers all kinds of opportunities to tweak your system. It is kind of cool having all those additional amps and tubes glowing in the night. There's no doubt about that. And it can sound phenomenal. So if you're interested, stick with us and we'll show you how to set up and use the PAP-C1 properly. Quick side note about the sound differences between a passive system that uses a passive crossover like this one or an actively bi-amp system. They both can sound fantastic, but there are some characteristic differences. A passive system, which is known as a first-order design, tends to be a bit more blended in nature. If I could use a food analogy, it would be akin to a fine consommé, a beautiful soup, something like that. Whereas an active system, using an active bi-amp system, tends to be a little more precise sounding in nature. Perhaps like a foie gras with huckleberries and a fine sauterne or something along those lines. But doesn't necessarily mean that the slightly more blended approach is inferior to a more precise approach. It's really what your ears prefer. But there are those general distinct characteristics between the two. Another thing to mention is we have great accessibility with the PAP speakers. The passive crossover that you see before you is wide out in the open. It's simply screwed into the base of the speaker, easy to put on and take off. If you want to try bi-amping, you really do have to have speakers where you can gain access to the drivers. Stated differently, if you have a sealed box system, bi-amping is probably not for you unless you're willing to cut a hole into those speakers, and I would urge you not do that. So this really is for speakers where you can access the crossover and, more importantly, run a speaker wire directly to the drivers in your system. The first thing you'll need to do when setting up the PAP-C1 is to remove the top. You'll need to have access to the potentiometers inside, and of course you'll also need a small screwdriver in order to be able to adjust them. It's a good idea to be able to pull out the unit and be able to push it back in without disturbing the wires, the interconnects behind, so make sure you have plenty of room back there. This is how we set up ours. Okay, let's get to actually setting up the PAP-C1. You might as well start by removing the passive crossovers from the base of your PAP speakers, which is easily done. Next, we would recommend installing the optional bi-amping distribution boards. These make it very easy to connect the speaker wire. Next, you'll install the interconnects into the back of the crossover. Where you see input, well, that's basically comes from the output of your preamp. The low out goes to the amps that are serving the woofers, and as expected, the high out goes to the amps serving the middle speaker, which serves the mid-range and the high frequency. A note on the mid-range and high-frequency speakers available from PAP. There's a vast array that they have available. They all have their pros and cons. What I urge you is that if you're bi-amping, don't get too hung up on which speaker that you have. All of the settings that we're going to talk about within the electronic crossover hold true for every speaker that you have. The final tweaking you'll do by ear, but it's not really the efficiency of the mid-range and high-frequency driver that's of concern to us. It's the woofers. The woofers are the least efficient of the drivers no matter which of the mid-range speakers that you have. By the way, woofers go well up into the mid-range, which is a unique feature of PAP speakers. The point is, whether you have the horns or the voxatives or any of the other mid-range high-frequency speakers from PAP, everything that we're going to talk about with regard to the crossover holds true. Okay, once we've hooked everything up, it's time to deal with the potentiometers inside the crossover. We're going to start with the crossover points for both the high and low frequencies. They are labeled high and low pass filters. These are also numbered P2, P6, P10, and P14, and their corresponding potentiometers P3, 7, 11, and 15. We're going to start with the low frequencies, P2 and P6. The potentiometers go from 120 Hz all the way up to 550 Hz. Now, where the proper crossover point is ultimately, you'll determine with your ears. And the cool thing is you can do this while the music is playing. But I do recommend a starting point of right about 350 Hz. So set your potentiometer there for both P2 and P6, and then set it at the same place for P3 and P7. We now have a starting point for the low frequencies. Next, we'll set the high frequency crossover points. Start with P10 and P14, and then we'll do the same thing with the corresponding P11 and P15. These crossover points go from 120 Hz all the way up to 750 Hz. I recommend a starting point of between 250 and 400 Hz, maybe right in between there. Set all four of the potentiometers at that point. The next thing to adjust is the peak adjustment, also known as the bass boost. This is labeled bass EQ inside the crossover. It's also labeled P4 and P8. A peak adjustment increases the amplitude of a specific frequency range in the bass region, typically between 40 and 100 Hz. Let's start with P4, which goes from 0 to an 8 dB boost. I recommend starting at about the 10 o'clock position, and then of course matching that with P8. P4 and P8 should be at the same position. Okay, the next potentiometers to deal with are the high frequency EQ. This is P12 and P16. These change the level or the volume of high frequencies. It acts like a high frequency EQ, not a single frequency, but affecting a range above a certain threshold. There's no boost here, but goes from 0 to minus 3 dB cut. In many ways, this acts like a notch filter, where if the potentiometer is fully clockwise, you get a 3 dB cut at a specific high frequency. Though it's a bit more surgical than a general high frequency EQ. I recommend keeping it at 0 dB to begin with, no cut. The last potentiometers inside the crossover that we want to address are the left and right high pass levels. I recommend that you leave these alone. These are general gain settings. You would only want to move these one direction or another if you have a very low or a very high output preamplifier. Otherwise, leave them at the factory settings. Okay, now that we've addressed all the potentiometers inside the unit, let's turn our attention to the two black knobs on the outside. These are loudness knobs. If any of you were around in the 1970s and remember knobs on receivers labeled loudness, well, these are very similar, and I really like that they're here. They only affect the low frequency, and can be really helpful if you're listening at low volumes. It helps boost the low frequency to give you a more full sound when the volume is down. The truth is, however, setting these at the correct level at any volume level is crucial. Feel free to play around with a setting that sounds best with your speakers, with your amps, in your room, to your ears. We found our sweet spot, and they're very rarely changed from that, perhaps only if listening late at night at low volumes and we need just a touch more boost at the bottom end. Okay, now that you have your electronic crossover hooked up and the potentiometer set at their starting positions, I would suggest you resist the urge to get in there and start tweaking those positions. Give it a few days, play some music, just let everything break in. What you might do is play around a bit with the loudness knobs and set them in the general position that makes sense for the volume at which you listen and your room and so forth, and whatever kind of amplifiers you have. Get those where it feels about right. Then, once you're ready to actually sit down in that sweet spot and start to listen critically, that's the time you'll want to have the little screwdriver at hand and begin to slightly tweak those potentiometers. I would recommend using music with which you are familiar. If you're into electronic music, that's fine, but try to mix in some acoustic music too, particularly dynamic music with some close-up vocal recordings. You want to hear the full spectrum. And as you're listening, look for holes in the frequency range. If you're not hearing something that you think you should, that may be a hole, and we can address that with the crossover points. Or if you hear some muddiness or some harshness, that may be also an indication that those potentiometers need to be tweaked a bit. So, what we'll talk about next is what you can expect to hear by adjusting the various categories of potentiometers inside the PAP-C1. Let's start with the low-pass filters. Here's what you can expect to hear if you move the potentiometers lower or higher from our starting point, which was about 350 Hertz. If you move those potentiometers down, more mid to low content is going to go to the woofer, meaning that the mid-range amp and speaker will handle less of the lower mid-range. It tends to sound a bit fuller or warmer as you lower that crossover point, but the risk, if you go too far, is muddiness. So here's what you might hear as you turn those potentiometers down slightly. A thicker sound, a more boomier sound, especially on male vocals or guitar notes or bass-heavy instruments. If you do it too much, there's a possible smearing or loss of clarity in the lower mids. We don't want that, so don't take it down too far. You also may perceive a dip or a disconnect if there is a gap in the response or poor blending between the drivers. So keep an ear out for that as you tweak those potentiometers downwards. For crossover points above the 350 Hz starting point, what will happen is more mid to low content will be handed off to the mid-range driver and its associated amplifier. This allows the woofer to cover a narrower range, focusing on deeper bass. So what you might hear as you raise above 350 Hz is improved clarity and articulation in the lower mids. This is assuming that the mid-range speaker can handle the extra range cleanly. Most PAP speakers certainly can. You also may hear, if you go too far above 350, a leaner sound in the low end, less warmth or weight. And if it's really pushed too high, it can result in a strained mid-range, especially if the speakers start to distort or lose control. Next, we'll talk about the high-pass filter. You'll recall that our starting point was somewhere between 200 and 400 Hertz. If you lower from that crossover point, more low to mid and mid-range content will be sent to the high-frequency amp and drivers. The woofers, therefore, handle less of the upper mid-bass and lower mid-range. What you might begin to hear as you move the potentiometer downward is a thicker, more full mid-range, perhaps due to overlap of frequencies. If you take it too far down, possible distortion can occur or just congestion if the high-frequency driver isn't designed to handle those lower frequencies. It may result in less clarity or even muddiness in the vocals or lower mid-range instruments. There's also potential phase and timing issues if there's too much frequency overlap between the low and high drivers. So that isn't to say that you shouldn't consider lowering it a bit from your starting point, but look out for those warning signs. What you might hear if you raise the potentiometer above that crossover starting point is clearer and cleaner upper mids and treble due to reduced loads on the mid-range and tweeter driver. You might also possibly hear some hollowness or a lack of body in vocals or mid-range heavy instruments, so be careful of that. The system may also sound less warm. It might sound thinner, so if you begin to hear that, you know you've gone a bit too far. If the woofer isn't great at reproducing the mid-range, you might lose detail and definition, but that's not likely to be a problem with PAP speakers, but do be on the lookout for that sound. Next, let's talk about the bass EQ potentiometers. If you recall, we started at about the 10 o'clock position, which would be probably about a 3 dB boost. What happens when you increase those potentiometers more towards the plus 8 dB is stronger lower frequency response. The bass will sound fuller, warmer, and more pronounced. You'll also hear more physical impact, more thump and punch in kick drums, for example, or in bass guitars and other low-end heavy instruments. You also might hear room interactions increasing, so be careful of that. Depending on your room's acoustics, you may hear more boominess or muddiness, especially if the room is not acoustically treated. There's also the potential for distortion. If your amp or woofer is pushed beyond its optimal range, you might introduce unwanted distortion or even risk driver damage, although that's not likely with just an 8 dB increase. But listen for these clues as to how high you should take it above that 10 o'clock position. Now, what happens if you decrease the bass EQ from our 3 dB or so gain down towards 0? Well, the bass will become tighter and cleaner. The low end becomes more controlled, more precise. You're also likely to hear better mid-range clarity. With less low-frequency energy bleeding into the mid-range vocals, you may have a cleaner sound, a more natural sound. It also helps to reduce listening fatigue, especially at high volumes. Less bass energy can result in a more balanced and less overwhelming sound. You also may hear a perceived drop in loudness and overall loudness. We humans are especially sensitive to bass, so reducing it can make the system feel less loud and a bit less exciting. So those are keys of what you want to look out for if you're going to lower that potentiometer. The last section we're going to discuss is high-frequency EQ, where the potentiometers go from 0 to minus 3 dB. We recommended starting at 0. So as you turn those potentiometers clockwise towards the minus 3 dB range, the treble will become softer. The most noticeable effect is that the high frequencies, things like cymbals, strings, sibilants, and voices, will become less prominent. The sound will feel less bright, less sharp. The overall tone balance will tend to shift as you move towards minus 3 dB. The system may begin to sound more mid-range heavy or bass forward depending on your crossover points and the level of your low-frequency amps. There's also a perceived warmth. Cutting the high frequency slightly to minus 1 or minus 2 dB can make the system sound warmer and smoother, which some people prefer after long listening sessions, or to tame overly bright tweeters or room acoustics. Here's some practical use cases for the high-frequency EQ. At our starting point of 0 dB, you're getting the full signal level to the high-frequency driver. This is a good baseline or neutral setting. This is why we started there. At a minus 1 to minus 2 dB, this is useful for fine-tuning the system that might sound a little bit too bright or harsh. If you take it all the way to minus 3 dB, you're going to see a fairly noticeable cut that may be appropriate if your tweeter is naturally louder or if you're dealing with a reflective or bright room. If you're anything like me, you're going to be spending several days, if not weeks, tweaking those little potentiometers, and that's just fine. But when you've got it to a point where you're happy with the sound and you're ready to put the crossover back onto its shelf, put the lid back on it, and so forth, I recommend that you take some time and readdress the loudness knobs. Those potentiometer movements, if you've made any, may make a difference in where the loudness knobs sound their best. Once you're done with that, you're ready to enjoy your actively bi-amped system. Well, I hope you enjoyed our overview of the PAP-C1 electronic crossover. Again, I would recommend you start off with the passive crossover. There's a lot to be gained out of this. But if you enjoy the tweaking and the fun that we have using different kind of amplifiers and different drivers, by all means check out the PAP-C1, and we hope that this video helps you understand how to set it properly, and from there, put on a record and tweak things ever so slightly to your liking.